Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, we return to our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours, with a conversation with Michael Ho. Michael is a professor of practice here at the Darden School of Business and also a member of the finance faculty. We talk with Michael about his background, what led him to Darden, the work he does at Fifth Third Bank, his experience in mergers and acquisitions, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. As always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my Office Hours conversation with Professor Michael Ho. Michael, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So just to give you a little bit of an overview for the conversation today, for those of you who maybe joined for one of these sessions, you know this already, but we'll spend the first 15, 20 minutes talking about Michael's background and what got him to Darden and what he teaches. And then we'll transition for the second half of the conversation to talk about some of his classes, some of the work that he does. So Michael, let's start off with the first question, which is tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Well, sure. I guess it all goes way back. I'm an engineer by training, although I really didn't spend a whole lot of time as an engineer. Ended up starting to work on Wall Street back in the early 80s, where I worked first with the First Boston Corporation in Midtown Manhattan. And then from there, worked in San Francisco for a boutique investment banking firm. And then ultimately took some time off in the early 90s. Went to the University of Virginia, went to Darden, got my PhD there in finance, then went back into industry and essentially have been leading a dual life ever since the early 90s, spending part of my time teaching on the faculty, first at Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and then for the past 25 years or so here at Darden. And then simultaneously also continuing my work as a practitioner, specifically in the area of M&A for the past 6 or 7 years. I have been the co-head of buy-side M&A advisory at a bank here in the United States called Fifth Third Bank. And so I oversee the bank's efforts and services for our clients to assist them on helping them buy other companies through the M&A process.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about what you shared there. So how did you decide to pursue a path into investment banking?
You know, it's interesting, and maybe some of you on the line will appreciate it, that, I come from a family where, the first and the highest aspiration for one's kids is that they be a doctor. Go be an MD. Well, I didn't quite have the smarts to do that. So I thought that next best thing I could be an engineer. So went off to engineering school and spent some summers actually working as a co-op student in engineering. And one of the nice things about engineering is that it's very mathematical, it's very analytical. There's always a right or wrong answer, right? So if you do the correct formulas, if you use the right assumptions, then basically your bridge won't fall down. If you input the wrong assumptions or use the wrong formulas, then your bridge falls apart and basically, cars go into the water and what have you. So it's either right or it's wrong. I had the privilege of spending one summer working on Wall Street as a summer intern. And what particularly blew me away was just very, very interesting was, number one, that people in business just think differently. They think differently from us engineers. I mean, we engineers, we see the world in black and white. Everything is very, very structured. It's very logical. But you get into the business world and those rules don't necessarily hold anymore. And so I think what I found most fascinating about the business world was that there are gray areas that, well, yes, you could perform phenomenal analytics. So in our world of business, you guys might be aware, it's probably Excel spreadsheets or it's simulation programs or something like that. And so you can have very fancy analytics, but that still may not get it done, whatever it happens to be. It doesn't necessarily tell you, for example, what's the best product to launch, or it doesn't tell you what region or demographic we be going after. Or in my space, it doesn't really tell you whether or not a company is a good buy or not. And I think that is what drew me ultimately into the business side, was that additional challenge of having to think more horizontally, having to think a bit more in gray areas. And I know that for many who come from the engineering and the science world, they come into our general management program at Darden. That's a little bit of an adjustment because we teach the case method, and we're so used to saying, "Well, just tell me what's the answer." And as a faculty, as a facilitator of the classroom discussion, one of the things that we have to avoid doing is we have to avoid coming down and saying, "Well, here is the one right answer," because in business, very often, most often, there actually isn't a single best answer. And so I think that's what drew me most into the world of business. I would say in general was it was a very different way of thinking. It was a very different paradigm. And so M&A just happened to be where I landed first. I think I'm a little biased here, but I think that M&A is probably the highest calling when it comes to finance or investment banking. It's probably the most cross-functional of any theoretic, I guess you could call it finance discipline, but it's like 4D chess, right? So it's constantly evolving. Everything, every time is different. The names are different. The people are different. The tactics, the strategies, they're all different. And you have to draw upon all of those. And they're not just finance issues. You have to draw upon all those to really be successful, either for yourself as a principal or successful on behalf of your client.
Well, Michael, I want to talk about your first trip down to Charlottesville as a PhD student. You obviously had worked for a while. How did you land on the idea of doing a doctorate?
Well, again, it's something cultural, I would have to say. Certainly, all of my family reunions, coming out of college, coming out of my master's program, all of my cousins, they're all MD PhDs. They're multiple PhDs. I mean, they're just incredibly smart, incredibly successful academically, and there's me standing in the corner, lonely with nobody to talk to. So I think there was a bit of a face-saving aspect to this. So I think that's part of it, but also when I got my MBA at the Sloan School at MIT, and I consider myself very fortunate that many of my professors were Nobel laureates and just scary smart, unbelievably smart. They're writing all the textbooks, they're doing all the groundbreaking theoretical research and modeling. But the challenge for us as students was that most of the faculty really they weren't effective communicators. They weren't able to really convey that massive intelligence that they had. And I think as far as a learning experience goes, they really fell upon the students' shoulders to essentially have to figure out what does all this stuff mean, and quite frankly, to translate the Greek into the real world. And so I think that was the second big motivator, was that I felt that an MBA education could be so much richer if the faculty in the room had at least some contact, some history with the real world, so that they could help to synthesize for the students the various frameworks and the theories that we were essentially presenting. And so that was a big motivator as far as why to get a PhD, because I thought that as a professor, as a teacher, that hopefully I could give back and contribute to the academic experience.
And you come to Darden, which obviously the emphasis here is on the educational experience and what happens in the classroom. I know from our prep conversations, you had some incredible sort of mentors as you were working on your dissertation.
Yeah, I tell you, it's interesting. It's sometimes it's hard to really tease out how all of these business schools are different. I mean, you guys will go to the websites, right? You'll log into silly things like this to see talking faces or what have you, right? And every business school likes to claim a particular approach or uniqueness about it. And it's very, very hard. It certainly was many years ago when we didn't have this thing called the internet. We only had two-dimensional paper brochures that we could read, and they all sounded neat. They all sounded particularly, I would say, differentiated. But the thing about Darden was that, again, I think that the emphasis on really developing and creating leaders for the next back then was the next millennium, but let's say the next generation. It really actually even carried over to the doctoral program. And so the faculty that I had, that I counted myself very fortunate to have had, both on my committee, but also around me. Now, many of them have retired, but they've left a legacy. They were they were excellent academics in their own regard. Now, granted, they were very applied, right? So they would take um, uh, executive management or management questions, issues that were being confronted with in the real world, policy issues, and then they were doing research around that. But they were also phenomenal in the classroom. Just you would sit through a couple of classes with them, and it was just amazing to see them to interact. And again, I mean, we refer to ourselves as faculty, but I like to actually think of ourselves more as facilitators, because the truly effective case method teachers are simply facilitators. We simply direct both the energy of the room, the conversation, and the dialogue. And so that was for me just an eye-opening experience, and I think it really enriched my doctoral experience.
Sort of natural segue to my next question is, what do you enjoy about teaching through the case method? This is a question that we've asked to everyone who's come on office hours. I've been interested in hearing people's different perspectives.
You know, and that's a hard question really to answer for a finance, right, professor, because everyone thinks, oh, finance, well, gee whiz, that's spreadsheet work and it's a lot of numbers. And again, there's either a right answer or there's a wrong answer. So, I mean, how do you do cases about that? And I will confess that it is more challenging to teach finance at the MBA level solely via case method. But that is what we do here at Darden. And I think that we do a pretty effective job at it. Now, you can scale up and scale down on the cases as far as with regards to complexity and real world issues. But I think that the most important thing about the case method, and what I enjoy most about it, is that it really requires setting context first. And I think for a general management program, one like Darden, if you're sitting in the classroom, if you're a participant in a case method class, then you need relevance. You deserve relevance, actually. It's not enough just to sit back and write down all the equations and to write down the frameworks and to draw the pictures. You really need to have, well, why are we doing this? Well, why is this important? And I think that the case method actually does that best of all, because that is what really, in your preparation, you're basically reading a story, 4 or 5 pages of a story. It's a real story, typically. It's probably something that you could allegorize to something that's happening right now, in fact. And I think that by teaching the analytics within that context, I think it really makes it come much more alive. Now, I think that the other thing that the case method does pretty well, even in finance, is at the elective level. And that's when you get into more complex situations, perhaps more industry specific situations. So I do and focus primarily in the area of M&A, but more generally in the area of corporate finance. Well, there's stuff every day that you can read about in the Financial Times or in the Wall Street Journal or what have you, that are real life questions that we would address in the electives. And those get incredibly detailed, but also they tend to be very unique. And so what the case method, I think, really strives to do is it really attempts to help us think more broadly, to think more in terms of frameworks or almost worldview, because it doesn't really do you any good to come out and just memorize a series of recipes, because unfortunately the real world is too complex to be just distilled down into 3 or 4 or 5 just simple step A, B, C, D, E, and F. And so I think with the case method, then it allows us to come at the problem in a variety of different ways. And also I think it does a good job of accommodating the various backgrounds that we have in the classroom as well, the various experiences that can then be brought to bear by the various participants.
It's also interesting to think about your background and experience. So you mentioned at the top that you are also working. You're employed at Fifth Third Bank. You lead buy side advisory for them. How does that add to what you're doing in the classroom? How does what you're doing in the classroom add to what you're doing in your day job?
Well, Brett, to be honest, there are probably some of my work colleagues who said that I don't actually work hard enough, but we'll put that aside for a moment. Um, Being a professor of practice is quite a privilege here at Darden, and again, I think consistent with Darden's ethos and culture, it really I think leverages the professor of practice program. We have practitioners, experienced executives, what have you, playing a role in the curricula and in various aspects of the student life. For me, I'm still actively involved in a variety of M&A transactions. I have 3 active transactions going on right now. So how does it actually impact what I do in the classroom? A couple of ways. First of all, even outside of the M&A elective, which I teach, so I would also bring these into, for example, into the core finance class, which I guess I'll be teaching here in a little bit. But specific transactions, specific um, encounters with clients, client behavior, client decisions, both the good and the bad, I think can often be brought into the classroom as additional illustrations as to how concepts are either applied or many times misapplied, and what the outcomes of those might be. Now, certainly for the corporate finance classes that I teach or that have taught, as well as the M&A elective that I teach, I'm able to actually bring in specific transactions, specific capital financings, if you will, capital raises that I've been a participant in, and I can actually bring those into the classroom itself. So, and bringing in guest speakers, sometimes they are colleagues of mine who I can bring in, and they can tell good war stories. And like, it's always good to bring in, I think, some battle tested veterans who can give additional color and flavor. But again, I think we ought not lose the reason why we do that, because there are some programs, there are some courses out there that you guys might end up encountering. I think they play very well because you get to see a lot of maybe potentially famous names that are guest speakers, what have you. I think that's okay, and I think there's a place for that. But we ought not lose sight of fundamentally why are we here, and therefore what role does a guest speaker or an outside speaker have? And so the guest speaker really needs to be reinforcing whatever we're doing within class, so whatever theoretical frameworks, whatever cutting edge approaches that we are covering within the classroom, that needs to essentially be exhibited, and it needs to be, I think, shown how it works in practice by our guest speakers. And so they have a very specific role to play here at Darden. And I think that's one of the nice things that we have. Certainly, with the professional program, being up here in DC, we have quite the number of resources, whether it's alums, whether it's people on the policy side, of course, with DC here, legislatures, lobbyists, what have you. And we've been able, I think, to incorporate them pretty well and make for a pretty enriching and unique program. Sorry, I used that word unique. I shouldn't use that, but I think it's a pretty special program.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your teaching experience. You've taught both full-time MBA students as well as executive MBA students, and you'll be even teaching part-time MBA students in the coming year. What do you enjoy about teaching executive MBA students? I'll share just a historical note. Michael has actually taught in our executive MBA program since the program's inception. The program is almost 20 years old at this point. And it's gone through a lot of growth and evolution during that time. But Michael, what have you enjoyed about working with working professional students?
Well, yeah, and I guess given that I think, Brett, you said that we actually have the entire range of those potentially interested, whether it's residential or professional executive MBA or part-time MBA. Let me reference the residential program, because I first started, so I came back to Darden in 2000, or maybe it was 2001, into the residential program. And in the residential program, I've taught most of the corporate finance electives there over the years. And with regards to, if you're interested in the residential program, I think that there are some real benefits to the residential program. I think an enjoyable thing there is that because they are literally living together you have a unique bond that is developed amongst the students. And also, I think that because of the way the classes are scheduled and the number of hours of actual face-to-face time that we have, I think the faculty as well are able to establish, I think, really enriching relationships both within the classroom and outside the classroom. And I think that that's probably what I enjoy the most about teaching in the residential program. Now, it's true. I would think that, and you know the numbers better than I, but I think that that's probably a slightly younger population, so I think that their work experiences are perhaps not quite as broad or as deep as we have in the professional degree program. I think, though, that certainly from a quantitative and analytic perspective, I think there's perhaps a little bit more willingness to just to get to roll up the sleeves and get their hands dirty, because in large part that's the role that they will be playing immediately upon graduation at Darden. So the courses that I taught there were slightly different in focus. I would say that they were probably a little bit more analytically focused. I would say that the M&A elective, when I took it over from the former dean, Bob Bruner, I crafted it to be a bit more aligned with what an investment banking associate would be actually doing on day one. So it was really targeted much more, I would say, in the analytics there. But so I think that's a little bit of a difference of the flavor. But again, getting back to the contact hours, I think one of my greatest and my most fond memories was actually this last semester, this past spring, where I taught the M&A elective, and actually it was the last time I was going to be teaching at Charlottesville, at least for the next couple of years. But I had a student who took it upon himself to essentially organize pub nights. So he basically would schedule and there was a sign-up sheet for pub nights after class, and or I would say after that day's class. And it was just a lot of fun to be able to hang out with the students for a couple hours each night, just over munchies and just to catch up on what people were doing in their lives. And with regards to the professional degrees program, and really, again, right now it's just the EMBA program because I don't start with the part-times until the spring. But what an entirely different group. Again, you're talking about a much, I was going to say older, but I think we're not allowed to say that. So let's say a more experienced and seasoned group of individuals, and really just a fascinating range of backgrounds. And I mean, whether you're talking not-for-profits, you're talking startups, you're talking a lot of like federal, or I should say government-related, public sector backgrounds, a lot of military. I don't know if they actually ever really retire, but let's say military folks that are maybe pivoting or at an inflection point. And so I think that the range of folks that you get in the professional degree program is much wider and much broader, which, again, that poses in some sense a little bit of a challenge to the faculty, because how do you get such a wide range essentially up to roughly the same level, and how do you get them to level set? And I think that's tough. It's tough, but also I think it's incredibly satisfying, I think, from a faculty perspective. And so with the professional degree program, in talking as well with some of my other faculty members, I think that we find the challenge of relevance to be of the utmost importance, because we're dealing with people who, many of them are currently still working. So time, and they have family oftentimes, or they have other obligations. So time really is of the essence. They don't have the time or the energy to wade through this much stuff of just pure unapplied theory. I mean, they really need to understand, okay, how is this either relevant to me right now, or how can I see it would be relevant to me in my next stage? And so that really gives rise to some very interesting and robust discussions in the classroom. And you can always expect that the participants in the classroom will bring in some ideas of application or experience which you would have never thought of, because just I've never lived in that world. I just have no idea. So I think that there's a richness there that is just very different from the full-time residential program.
I want to talk about your M&A elective that you teach in the Executive MBA program a little bit later. But before we get there, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about what M&A is, because we have all kinds of people who have joined for this call. Some people may know that world intimately, and some people may not know that much about mergers and acquisitions, maybe doing a Google right now to kind of try to learn up on exactly what that is. So how do you explain what M&A work is to someone?
Yeah, I had to get really good at this because my family, bunch of doctors and all, they didn't understand it either. So back in the day, I had to come up with something that was reasonably understandable. M&A really, honestly, is a very broad term. Um, it can have a specific application, but I think that the way we like to think about it here at Darden is that mergers and acquisitions is essentially when companies buy or sell other companies. And again, those companies could be divisions, so they don't have to be the entire organization itself, but they are all or in part. And so we would break down mergers and acquisitions into basically buy side and sell side, and that's nothing more than are we looking at this from the seller's perspective, or are we looking at it from the buyer's perspective? Mergers and acquisitions, M&A, actually gets a fair amount of press. So to the extent that you are considering a business school program, I'm going to presume that as one of the activities that you've undertaken in your preparation for this is that you're at least now paying attention to at least one, if not more than one, periodical in the business world, whether that's the Financial Times, that's Bloom, that's the Economist, that's the Wall Street Journal, what have you. And so if you do that, then I think what you will find is you'll see a number of headlines that oftentimes come around, which is announcing that Microsoft has just announced that they're going to be acquiring so-and-so, or Eli Lilly has just announced that they're going to be acquiring this bio firm for this much money. Well, whenever you see that, that's essentially an M&A. That's a merger and acquisition. And so it's very, very complex because there's a very wide range of parameters of variations on M&A. So, for example, a merger and acquisition could involve a publicly traded company or publicly traded companies. That is, those are companies that have their stock is traded on an exchange. That means that you and I, as individual investors, we could go out or not even go out. Nowadays, we can just go on our computer and we could buy some shares and hope that it goes up and maybe get really, really rich and use that to pay for our tuition at Darden, something like that. Or M&A could involve companies that are not publicly traded. They could, for example, just be family owned. Maybe some of you all are working at a family company. Well, M&A can certainly involve those as well, either as buyers or as sellers. M&A could involve just making a small or a nominal investment in a company. Sometimes you'll see that, for example, in the popular press, where you'll read about a certain individual who has probably more money than they deserve. But in any case, they have a lot of money and they accumulate a number of shares in, let's say, Walt Disney Company or what have you. Why? Because they're really unhappy with the Star Wars spinoffs, right? And so the investor comes in, buys some shares, maybe makes an investment of 25% of the company because they want to change something. Well, in some respects, that could also be considered to be M&A as well. So you have a variety of different parameters that would still qualify for M&A. But then beyond that, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, as far as M&A being a cross-functional business issue, M&A involves, the actual transaction itself involves not just finance people like investment bankers, but it involves lawyers, it involves accountants. Many times it will involve subject matter experts like engineers. It might involve people that are experts in the biopharma side, for example. So it touches a lot of different career paths and professional paths. And then finally, what makes for a good transaction or a wise M&A? Whether is it wise to sell your business into this person, or is it wise to acquire, to buy this business? Well, how does one answer that? Fundamentally, it's actually not a finance question. Fundamentally, it's it's a strategy question, or it's a marketing question, or it's an operations question, like a manufacturing question. In fact, it's a question, or it is made up of questions that is addressed by all of the other business school disciplines that we would have to cover here, that you would get a chance to cover here at Darden, which again, I think as a general management program really is well positioned to equip you to deal with these broad-ranging cross-functional challenges.
Well, we're about halfway through our conversation here. I just want to give a quick plug. If you have questions for Michael, please feel free to ask via the Q&A. We've got some questions for him queued up, but I'm certainly interested in what our audience might like to hear more about. So, Michael, you referred to M&A work as four-dimensional chess, and this very sort of interdisciplinary nature of the work. I'm curious, like, how do companies decide to merge or acquire another company? Like, you work with obviously folks on a daily basis. How do they make these decisions?
Yeah, too often they make them badly, to be quite frank. For those of you on the call that are familiar or maybe have read some of the articles about it, it's pretty well known in the both popular press as well as in the McKinsey or the BCG and Bain type research writings or what have you, that M&A, at least for the buyer, that buyers generally lose when they acquire another company of any size or substance. And so that raises a question. Well, gee whiz, if buyers generally lose, they lose, whether in terms of value, they lose in terms of market share, or by whatever metric, then why do companies still end up buying other companies? In other words, why does M&A still happen? I mean, is it just because investment bankers are really persuasive? Or, I mean, why does this happen? And it's a good question to ask. And in fact, it was a question that puzzled me and my fellow co-head of buy side at Fifth Third, who, by the way, also is a Darden PhD, and he's actually on the faculty at University of Florida. We both knew, because of our own experiences, that it in fact is not true that buyers always lose. In fact, we had a number of consulting clients in the past, like a Dell Computer as an example, or a Cisco Systems, or a GE, that, if not for a time, maybe even over a longer period of time, have actually been quite successful in their acquisitions. So why is it that they can be successful, but if you look at the data as a whole, it's actually generally true that on the whole, the average or the median is that the buyers tend to lose? Well, as it turns out that there are three key success factors, best practices, if you will, that successful acquirers regularly implement to be successful in M&A. So, Brett, to answer your question, how does a company decide whether or not to buy or not? Well, first and foremost, critical success factor number one is that the decision to buy a company, or perhaps to sell or divest of a division, must be rooted in strategy. Okay, what is the overall corporate strategy of the business? I didn't say anything at all about the finance. I didn't say anything about dollars or numbers. It comes down fundamentally to what is the strategy of the business. Now, of course, how do you answer that question? Well, that's a very, very broad question, which again pulls in all these other disciplines, all these other business school disciplines, which must be addressed, in coming up with what that strategy is. Also, that corporate strategy is not developed in a vacuum. So there are internal issues such as business model, operational strategy, whether it's organizational structure, what have you. Those are internal issues which are going to impact or help define the strategy. But you also have to worry about the exogenous or the external factors, such as the industry dynamics, such as the competitive landscape, more broadly, such as the global macroeconomic trends and issues such as that. So you have exogenous and internal issues that all form the corporate strategy. But strategy leads first. It must always lead first, which means then that if the strategy is we must accomplish X, Y, and Z, or we must grow at a particular rate, but within the context of our industry, our competitive analysis, we cannot do that organically. We must then consider inorganic growth strategies like M&A. So it starts there. It leads you to M&A as a possible tool to help us execute on our strategy. The second key success factor is one of discipline and patience, right? That means that you have to be willing to buy or sell when markets are good or when markets are bad. So you don't look at the Dow Jones, you don't look at the FTSE index up or down, you don't look at Bitcoin. You basically say, look, is this the right time from a business strategy perspective to make this acquisition or to sell this division or what have you? So you must be very, very disciplined. And that also means that every time you get a phone call from an investment banker, and there are tons of these investment bankers, and I know because I got 100 of them as my colleagues at Fifth Third, who are constantly calling companies saying, hey, we are selling a business. Would you like to buy it? And unfortunately, too many companies are reactive and they basically say, oh, look, there's a shiny new object. Or alternatively, if you're from the States, it's like, oh, look, a squirrel. They go chasing after that. And inevitably, what ends up happening is that either they end up wasting their time and they don't win the deal, or they actually do win the deal. And now you have the proverbial dog who caught the car problem, and they're not quite sure what to do with it. So the second key point is maintaining discipline and maintaining patience. And the third and the final aspect is you must be proactive. So that means if you're thinking about if your strategy says we need to expand into a particular area where these particular target companies reside, you need to be proactively engaging those companies in dialogue as a potential target before they actually go for sale. Because what you ideally want to have happen is you want to have established that relationship with those potential targets, those potential sellers, before they sell. Because best case scenario, in that case, you don't actually have to compete with other buyers for that particular company. So I would say that those are the three key aspects that go into a successful acquirer when they're thinking about buying a company.
Sort of the flip of that question, Michael, is like you mentioned that buyers oftentimes feel like they didn't get the result that they were hoping for. Like, what are some of the mistakes that you see companies make when merging, acquiring companies?
Right. So Brett's question is, what are the reasons why buyers don't win, why they actually fail? Well, as a finance professor, what's my natural response? Well, naturally, it's because they didn't run the right numbers. They didn't pay the right price or what have you. But the right answer is, more often than not, the reason why acquisitions fail is either number one, it wasn't based or founded upon the right strategy. Okay, they bought it because it wasn't well thought through. It didn't actually accomplish what they need to actually accomplish. So that's key issue number one. So it wasn't well thought through ahead of time. Key issue number two is that essentially there wasn't a lot of experience or preparation in place when they embarked upon the process. So too often when you get involved in an M&A transaction, and this is part of the 4D chess thing, is that it takes on a life of its own. And so the process can either move very, very quickly, or it can move very, very slowly with lots of interruptions, many of which are unforeseen. And if you're not really well prepared before you get into the process, sometimes the process ends up steamrolling you, and that's where you make mistakes. The third and the final aspect, believe it or not, yes, a finance professor is going to say it's the people issues. It's those intangible people issues. It's because buyers don't plan ahead on how are you going to manage the people issues? How are you going to bring them in? How do you deal with cultural differences? How do you deal with hurt feelings? Did you know that one of the top 5 biggest concerns of employees of a company who has just announced they're going to be sold? You might think it's, gee whiz, who am I going to report to? What's my job? Actually, one of their number one concerns is what happens to my email address. And as a buyer, you're focused on big things like, is it $1.5 billion am I going to pay, or is it $1.6 billion? You don't worry about what's going to happen to the email system of the sellers and what the impact is that going to have on the employees. But it's really the people issues. And so what we advise our clients is, so you need to be thinking about the people issues and the post-transaction integration issues. at the very beginning, not at the end, not when you're closing the deal and you're handing the money over. You need to address it right up front with everything else. And again, as a finance person coming out of business school with a finance degree, thinking that the sole answer is all about how big my spreadsheet is, that just blew me away. I didn't really fully realize about those intangibles and how everything was all linked and interlinked together.
It seems like just listening to you talk about these things, it's incredibly important to be sort of disciplined in your approach and to have a very sort of process-oriented approach. Because I imagine, like, to your point, like calls are coming in, there's so many opportunities you could take, but you can't chase every opportunity. You have to be really methodical about it.
No, that's exactly right. And a lot of companies really have very limited resources when it comes to M&A. Again, whether you've decided to sell one of your divisions or whether or not you want to acquire another company. And oftentimes the people that get tasked to do this M&A have day jobs. I mean, that might be the CFO, the VP of Finance, the Director of Business Development, what have you. And quite frankly, they've got a lot of other things that they've got to do. And now you've saddled them with this really intensive project, which is totally unpredictable. It could change on a moment's notice, which is why investment bankers, they always look like they age 4 years for every 1 year, because they have no control. It just everything is unpredictable, which I think actually is one of the most enduring aspects of M&A, but it's very challenging. And so as an organization then, if M&A, and for any organization of any size, M&A is going to have to be a tool in their toolkit if they are going to effectively compete in the future. Then what that means is they need to have, number one, they have to have educated and experienced staff that can actually execute on this. So they have to have the right people in place. Number two is they have to have the right incentives in place such that when a situation comes up and you essentially assign those specialists to that project, that they're not penalized somehow on their day job or regular stuff. And then the third and the final thing is so that you have to make sure that you have the right kind of outside counsel. And again, that's something that a lot of, certainly the smaller companies, with first time in M&A, they oftentimes think that they can just get away with their current lawyer or their current accounting firm. But if their lawyer is basically a general attorney who's never actually done M&A before, or their accountants are a small local town-based accountant who really has no experience in this, then that's going to put you under a great deal of stress in the process itself. And if that isn't enough to motivate you in thinking about that external team ahead of time, just know that deals that have the least friction, that are the most plain vanilla, result in the highest value for the seller and for the buyer, the highest value created. It's when you get into the messiness and the unpredictable stuff, that's where you start to that's where you start to spend money. That's where you start to lose price, if you will, if you're on the sell side. So yeah, it can be quite the challenge for, I think, a corporate organization to undertake M&A on a regular basis.
You said a few times that M&A is unpredictable, that there are these obviously there's a lot of stuff that happens. Like what are some examples of like the unpredictable things that might develop during a merger or acquisition?
Well, so again, let's talk internal issues and external issues. So from an internal perspective, unforeseen things can be such as what happens if you have some key employees that leave, either right before or in the middle during the process itself. What do you do there? Other issues. What do you do when news of the fact that either you're acquiring such company or you are a company that is selling? What do you do when it leaks out or when rumors start to circulate? You get calls from your customer or from your suppliers about, hey, this is what I just heard. What's actually happening? Have you thought about that? Have you planned for that? So I think those are some unexpected twists and turns, fires that will need to be put out. Externally, what sort of unforeseen things? Well, here's an example we can give, which is directly relevant to this year's M&A class, and that is, what do you do when the transaction involves a buyer and a seller such that, at least in the United States, and this would also work, by the way, if you're in the EU, that you would be required, as part of the laws and the regulations, to file for antitrust issues, for an antitrust review. Well, what do you do there? Because that's something you cannot control. You cannot control the government when it comes to their rules and regulations, number one. And number two, you can't control their timing and their process. And so just a little bit of a preview, but one of our backbone case in the M&A course that we're looking at reviewing now involves a large publicly traded company in the United States who is acquiring our client, a small family-owned business, and we had to secure antitrust review prior to closing the deal. And it ended up extending the discussions and the dialogues for almost 18 months while we were in the review process.
Michael, we've started to get some questions to the Q&A. I'm sort of right on topic here. So one question is, I know there are consulting firms that have M&A practices. Like, how would consultants potentially be involved in these transactions? You talk about lawyers and accountants, but what about consultants?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's a good question because it really points out that M&A is not just doing the deal. It's not just that very narrow time frame where you've got the investment bankers, the lawyers, and they're flying in the private jets, and it's just like in the movies, this, that, and the other. That's only a small part of M&A. And as we've already referenced, to truly be successful in M&A, there's got to be some strategic thought that is a precursor to the actual execution of the M&A. And so the consulting firms, and again, the consulting firms could be the big ones like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, LEK, what have you. But it also nowadays more than ever includes the consulting arms of the accounting firms like PwC, E&Y. We have a number of Darden alums at E&Y as an example, Parthenon, Deloitte. So they all have also these arms that help companies think about, review the kinds of companies either that are currently in the portfolio of the company itself, or as you're thinking about acquiring other companies. And so these consulting firms then will do a lot of that background and support work around what is the strategic imperative for M&A. What is the role that M&A should and can play within the overarching corporate strategy? And that they can play a very effective role there. They usually don't play a role in the actual execution, and there are a variety of reasons as to why that is. That the actual execution, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, 18 months, what have you, usually is the domain of the investment bankers, the M&A attorneys, the accountants, and the other specialized advisors within the execution itself.
Question here from the Q&A as well about how the M&A work might shift if, let's say, we have a U.S. company acquiring a company in Asia or a European company acquiring an Asian company. As you think about this sort of international dimension to the work, anything that comes to mind?
That's also a very good question. I think it's also timely for Darden. In one of my prior lives, I was actually head of Asia Pacific investment banking, and so my time in that role was strictly cross-border stuff, both inbound into the States and as well as outbound from the States. So most of the M&A issues that we talk about, at least in principle, are going to be relevant regardless of your domicile and whether or not it's cross-border. Adding the cross-border dimension, however, takes it from 4D chess to 7D chess. So if you can now think along 7 dimensions, and this is what makes cross-border deals so incredibly challenging and require that much more in the way of preparation. Why? Because, of course, if you are basically inbound, then you've got to worry about the local law. And that local law is not just legal law regulations, but it's also going to be tax issues as well. And ultimately, post-transaction will be what is the accounting impact to you on a consolidated basis, right? So you've just taken it up a notch. Not only do you have to deal with the local issues, but you're going to have to deal with the home country issues as well. Number one. Number two is that it sure would be nice if we had one consistent legal and tax framework across the developed and even the developing economies. Of course, the answer is we don't. We don't have that. And so as a consequence, your outside advisors now are going to go up 2-3 times in numbers, again, and in scope and in complexity. So once again, the level of your preparation and knowing what you're getting into becomes that much more important. And then, of course, I would say as well, from a finance perspective, got to get this in. But your choice of financing, where you choose to finance, the risk management issues vis-a-vis cross-border currency exchange, all of those could potentially become an issue as well.
A question here about advising clients in a high interest rate environment. So one of the hot topics, I think, as we talked about in M&A, as we were prepping for this call, is interest rates in the United States in particular, but other countries as well, just high right now, given inflation and all these kinds of things. So how do you advise a client? What are some of the considerations as you look at a deal in this particular interest rate environment?
Yeah. So if you've got a client that is one of the not the average that we had talked about before, right, which is basically a loser's reaction, whatnot. If you're talking to a best in breed acquirer, or for that matter, seller, right, then that's going to be somebody who makes the decision to buy or to sell, irrespective of interest rate environment. In other words, you do a deal because it's the right time to do the deal. And it's the right time to do the deal because strategically it makes sense to do the deal. It makes sense to sell this division and divest it, or it makes sense to acquire another business. Now, having said that, does that mean then that interest rates or the interest rate environment and other macroeconomic variables like cross-border or cross-currency exchange rates, does that mean that they are irrelevant? No, it doesn't mean that they're irrelevant. But what it does then impact is it's going to impact your valuation. So that basically ends up becoming a price issue. And so what we've seen with the increased global interest rate environment, we have seen a little bit of, I would say, a dampening down of M&A activity. But what we really have seen is we've really seen a reduction in pricing. And so what we've seen that pricing in general on a relative basis has come down, say, 1 turn or 1.5 times, say, an EBITDA type of evaluation. So it's come down about maybe 10 or 15%, but deals are still getting done as they should be getting done, again, if it makes strategic sense.
The valuation end of this is always fascinating to me. You always hear about companies overpaying, or did they pay too much, or this kind of thing. How hard is it really to do, effective valuation? I mean, we've got obviously tools to do this, but you still see companies overpay. So is it hard?
It is very, very hard. And one of the things that I open up actually in the core class about finance is I tell them is that finance is just a tool. It is a means to the end. It is not the end in and of itself. And that is not, or not even more, I think, starkly than in M&A, because yes, in M&A, we do a lot of analytical work. We do a lot of forecasting, this, that, and the other. But the primary purpose for that really is not about valuation and pricing. I mean, yes, you have to do that so that you have an idea as far as what is a reasonable range versus outside that reasonable range to impose that discipline on you. It's actually an exercise that we'll be doing in our core finance class in a couple of weeks, where we actually have the participants go through that exercise. But rather, I think that the whole modeling and the forecasting and the valuation work in an M&A context is best thought of as that it's the tool that we need to keep us accountable, right? It keeps us honest in our thinking of, wow, this is a great deal. This should be a wonderful deal. Why? Well, because the marketing folks say so. Well, okay, but how does that actually translate into numbers? So it forces a discipline on the company to really put their feelings, if you will, into actual hard numbers. And then I think the B side of that, as far as whether or not it is a good deal or not a good deal, it's something that you're really not going to realize for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years if it's truly strategically based. And this is where a lot of companies, quite frankly, they give up. They do the deal and they just kind of forget about it. Best in class, they are constantly revisiting all the analyses that was done as part of the transaction, 6 months, 12 months check-in, 24 months check-in, 36 months check-in, to see what actually happened. Where did we go right when it comes to the forecast? When did we go wrong? Not so that they can basically fire people, but rather so they can iterate through that process of taking their feelings, their gut, translating that into the numbers so they can be more effective next time.
Well, a couple more questions here as we wrap up. Just got a few more minutes, but the Q&A, some really great questions here. So, Michael, question about your experience. Is there a particular industry that you focused on, or is it just M&A broadly, any kinds of companies?
In the past, yes, I've had a special focus on the technology side, given my engineering background, and the biopharma side. I did that in a prior life. As I mentioned, I did cross-border stuff with Asia, primarily Japan and Southeast Asia, inbound and outbound to Silicon Valley. Currently at Fifth Third, honestly, most of our work tends to mirror the Fifth Third franchise, which is going to be mostly old economy type companies, manufacturing, service oriented businesses, consumer retail, building products and the like. So on the buy side right now, I am a generalist.
All right, question here. Sort of, we talked about success, what makes a successful M&A, but all right, let's say your company, you acquired another company and it's just not going well. It's unsuccessful. How do companies deal with that? Like, what do you see, when people get into this and they're looking at it and they're like, oh, this is not what we thought it was going to be? Like, what happens?
Tough question, right? And each situation is going to be different, but more often than not, the reason why deals are not successful, again, is a people issue. So if you think about the good to great type stuff, right? The idea there is that you put your best and your brightest on the best opportunities that you have. And so if things aren't working out right, then that means that the people that you have, the people on the bus that you have, are not the right people. And in M&A, time oftentimes is not your friend. In other words, quick, decisive action is what's really warranted. So if you get into the situation, either you are surprised, maybe you didn't do quite the diligence that you should have done. Okay, better luck next time. But how do you deal with the problem in front of you? You have to move decisively. And then that means you need to take the opportunity to make the changes and to make the bold changes quickly. And that might mean letting people go. It might be jettisoning some activities that were, in fact, not value creating from the get-go. It's really going to be a lot of focus on that. And really, I think the other thing as well is ensuring that you have continuity from the pre-transaction teams to the post-transaction teams so that they are able to see that all the way through as well. But very often it's going to be, hey, just take good notes and just make sure the next time you do a deal, you don't make the same mistakes.
All right, two more questions here, Michael. We got a question about this may be a difficult question to answer, but when you think about a well-executed merger, is there an example that you use in your class of like a classic, this is something that went really well?
I don't know if I would say that there's a specific example of a transaction. I do think that we do point to certain firms that do have a track record of making very good acquisitions and being successful in it. And I've mentioned a couple of them, before that really, I think a lot of the best practices have come out. And for those on the call, if you are interested in that, I do suggest, I think that the McKinsey, Bain, and BCG knowledge, their knowledge base, the articles that they run, they often will do profiles on some of their clients that they feel have been particularly successful, and they give really good case studies, examples of that. I would encourage you to look those up, and they're free. They're freely available. They're oftentimes good reading.
You mentioned this specter of antitrust, and this has obviously become a very hot topic in the U.S. FTC has started to be very interested in this. How are companies navigating mergers, acquisitions in this environment?
Yeah, Brad, and it's not just in the U.S., right? It's the EU as well. The EU antitrust regulatory regime is also quite strict. So what's happened here, certainly in the States, and I think in the EU are ahead of us by about 6 to 12 months in adapting to this, but essentially now we can't take anything for granted. And so now we are having to build into our process timing and expectations, as well as bringing in the right kind of antitrust counsel on board earlier rather than later into the process. So we have to bake it in. And that means that our deals now are taking longer. Instead of 3 months, they might be taking 6 or 9 months because we have to incorporate this.
All right, last question, Michael. Obviously, we touched on a lot. Thank you so much for your time. And to our attendees, thank you so much for being here today. But a word of advice for these folks as they think about their own MBA journey, something you would encourage them to consider.
Well, I think that you've already done the first thing, which is you've logged in, you're experiencing as much of the content and the exposure as Brett and his team are able to provide you. Take advantage of all that if you can, and not just at Dart, but all at the other schools. Really, though, try to, if you can, identify or maybe get those on the other end of the screen to articulate for you what they view as being the core competencies of that program. And that the core competencies are not just something that they feel that they do well, but something that they feel that they do well that is differentiated amongst the other potential choices that you have. And I think that's going to be the fundamental key. And then just basically match that up and see, well, what is it that you really feel are the competencies that you lack, that you want to basically, the gaps you want to fill. Maybe there are gaps that you have, competencies you have that you want to leverage, but then so you use that to map against your own competency set, and then I think we'll give you the best fit.
I appreciate that. Very systematic approach. Well, Michael, thank you for your time. And again, our attendees, we so appreciate your joining us for these office hours. We got one more coming up in August with Sasha Zork, member of the Decision Analysis faculty. So join us back for that. As always, this session was recorded. We're going to share it out on our Vimeo channel as well as on our admissions podcast. And I think some of you may actually be logging in shortly for the full-time MBA application launch webinar. So thanks so much for spending time with Dart today. And Michael, have a great class. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much. Good luck to you all.
And that was my recent office hours conversation with Professor Michael Ho. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, if you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, at virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.